Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project, and thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I have a fantastic guest with me today, and oh my goodness, what an incredible story she has to share with us. Her name is Dr. Vivien Sieber. She is a biologist, an experienced lecturer with a specialty in genetics and academic development. She is also an author and the daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. Her book, titled Kino and Kinder, chronicles the story of a European Jewish family's struggle to survive in the face of Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It is a family Holocaust history, from a family-run cinema in Vienna to matron of a hostel for girls saved by the Kindertransport. Vivien, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
What an amazing story. I mean, we already had an incredible conversation before we started recording, but what an incredible family history. So I'm just going to ask you to share your story. You can start wherever you would like to start. I think that just starting with the great-grandparents, if you want to go back that far, would be really, really great, because then we could have a definite chronicle in the history of the family and understand the dynamics.
Thank you. Well, my great-grandparents were drapers in Brno, which is the capital of Moravia then. It's in Czechoslovakia now. And they built up and they had 3 shops in the Kraut Market, which is the sort of main square. And they lived in a huge apartment above one of the shops. My grandmother was the youngest of 5 children. She was really small, incredibly pretty, and very determined. And so she made the mistake many pretty girls do of marrying the first man who asked her and moved to Vienna. And it was a complete disaster. He was older than she was. He was leading a really dissolute life. He had mistresses. And eventually her GP very shyly said, he's got venereal disease. So she grabbed the baby, got the train and went back to her parents. And she stuck around in Brno, probably very bored. I don't think she really enjoyed having a toddler. And this is a bit none of us can understand. She persuaded the family they needed to sell one of the shops and buy a cinema in Vienna. And they did. And she and her older sister Zelma, as single women, moved to Vienna to run the Palace Kino. And it was a great success. She was the very public face of the cinema. She chose the films, worked out the music, because they were silent at first. And whilst her sister was the quiet one who sold the tickets and made sure there was toilet paper and coal. And then she met my grandfather and married, and they were incredibly happy. And my dad came along. But then tragically he was killed in a road traffic accident. So she was left with 2 boys, her cinema to run. And she and Herman, my grandfather, were living in a really smart flat, which overlooked the Ringstrasse. Now, the Ringstrasse is the big road with the Grand Palais and the Opera House and the Burg Theatre. Anyway, she goes on working with her sister, and life begins to deteriorate because Hitler's come to power in Germany. Anti-Semitism is seeping across the border, and sometimes in very subtle ways. So Austria actually had a film industry, but because they couldn't sell films to Germany if anybody Jewish was employed on it, people then, actors left, often to the States or other parts of Europe. But so did all the film crew and things. And essentially the Austrian film industry was slightly destroyed. Conditions get worse and worse, but by then my dad was at school. He was 16. And then the Anschluss, which was when Hitler and the Nazis simply marched across the Austrian border through Austria and into Vienna. Now, they marched, there are photographs of the triumphal march around the Ringstrasse. Well, my grandmother and father watched it from their flat windows. Yes, so that's when she realized she's going to have to send her son to safety. Now, by then, his much older brother was already living in London. He'd married and moved to London in the early 30s. So the obvious thing to do was to send Peter to his older brother. And it was quite difficult, but compensation had been paid from the car crash. So there was compensation to Peter till he left school, or till he was about 21. Now that money hadn't been used, so it could be used to pay his exit taxes. She couldn't persuade any of the rest of the family to leave. And there are, in my dad's journals and manuscripts, there's this sort of heartrending, the family sees him off at the train station. He was literally just 17. Then he made this journey from Austria to England all on his own.
Wow.
She then realizes that she needs to escape, and it's much, much harder because there are no assets. The cinema was confiscated, and papers from the Austrian archives have been absolutely amazing, sending bushels of papers, show that it was valued and confiscated. It was just given to Nazis to run very soon after the Anschluss, which meant that my grandmother and her sister were being paid less than they needed to pay the staff. My great aunt, Zelma, had just been widowed, so she wasn't really in any state to think about leaving. She just wanted to stay in the familiar cinema. She lived in the apartment block behind. And so, of course, my grandmother had to leave money for her to live off. And I think one of the things that became very clear is there's less and less money around. You know, they're being paid less than they need to pay out. She tries to sell her possessions, but then every other Jew in Vienna is trying to sell their possessions. Flat was really smart, but it was leased on very low rent. And in the end, she has to appeal to a former lover. And I think for money, he's in Belgrade, and he sends money, to help my dad in London. And it must have been really difficult for such an independent woman who has, after all, said she won't marry this man because she said being married twice was enough, to then say, can I have some money? That must have been really hard. But then she does this heart-rending round of saying goodbye to her relatives, who she didn't see again, and crossing Europe. You know, the flats, she's allowed to bring the contents of one room, but I can remember her telling me how SS officers simply smashed her china. You know, they just put their rifle butts into the packing case. And so she came to England to find that her eldest son, although he'd been saying London was lovely, he'd had a job as the commercial rep for an Austrian engineering company. But of course, that was taken over by the Nazis and was making armaments. So they no longer needed a sales rep in London. And so Eric was living very hand to mouth. This flat in Streatham, which he'd written and said how lovely Streatham was. It wasn't really a village, but it was, you know, near to London. And, you know, the streets were paved with gold. Well, she found it was actually rather full because it already had my father in it, and a son and his wife, and that they didn't have any money anyway. And so she got a job as the assistant matron in a hostel for girls saved on the Kindertransport. But that's in Newcastle, which is in the northeast. And she's also had to learn English. She didn't speak English when she arrived. But the boys, she used the little dictionary she'd given my dad when he was at school, and learnt 10 or 20 words a day, and the boys tested her. And what is remarkable is that within 6 months, she's writing to my dad in English, in really good English, which meant that I could read that, I could pick up the letters, which told me quite a lot about the story.
Wow. What an incredible gift to have those letters.
Well, I got the photographs as well. So I got this big box of photographs going back to the early 1900s. And what my dad had done is he just stuffed pictures in used envelopes. And he'd written things like, Herman, Peter's father, Herman, family. Paula, Peter's mother. And there was some where I had no clue who these people were, which was one of the things that set me off on doing the book in some ways. So I had the photographs, and I had his survey. The Kinder stayed in touch with my grandmother sort of throughout her life. So I'd known about them when I was a child because they would visit or send cards. There are lovely photographs of, you know, very stiff people having weddings in the 70s.
Right.
And two little children on a beach with no clothes on, also from the 70s. So that and they're from all over the world now. And so before he died, my dad did this survey of the Kinder, and he got in touch with as many as he could make contact with, asking what they'd done with their lives, what had happened when they left the hostel, what families they had, what jobs they had. And so I inherited this file from my dad, which gave me the contact details, and also incredibly moving letters about what it was like to grow up in school where antisemitism started, having to leave your parents when you're very young, adjusting to life in a foreign country, a different school, no language, different food, and what they went on to do, which was lovely because most of them went on and had careers, often in the caring professions and education. Some went on to university, even though there was no funding for it. They found ways. And most married and had children and grandchildren. So as they moved around the world. And I've been privileged enough to meet a few. And they've been really generous, sort of inviting me around and talking about their childhoods. And others, it's been emailed because obviously you can't pop around to Australia.
Well, it can be done, but I don't think you'd want to. Did you ever meet your grandmother?
Yes, I was in my late 20s when she died. So yes, I knew her quite well. And she was by then tiny. And I'm nearly 6 foot, and she was sort of barely under 5 foot. So there was quite a lot of joking about that. She was, of course, very old, and I was very young and naive. But she used to tell me about the lovely life she'd had with my grandfather, you know, going to balls and private nightclubs and things like that. But she'd also was very, very distressed that her, you know, only 2 members of the family survived. And I think she felt guilty that she had left and the others hadn't. And she was very bitter about the cinema, which that was the sort of second half of the book. It's where I used papers from the archives a lot to reconstruct what happened to the cinema. And here I have to thank Helen and Heinz Rupertsberger in Vienna, who are the conservators of the Josefstadt database, Jewish database. Because I wrote to them and said, I thought it was an easy question. How can I find out what happened to the cinema after the war? And 2 weeks later, I got a totally courteous message in English with a timeline summary. They'd been to the archives. And Helen had photographed 120 documents and put them in Dropbox for me. I mean, this is total kindness. And so between us, we worked out that the cinema operated throughout the war with no investment, nothing. So it was pretty dilapidated at the end of the war. It's changed its name from Palast Kino to Palast Lichtspiel. And that's because apparently Hitler didn't like kino because it was a Greek word. So all the cinemas changed to Lichtspiels. And then it's put in the hands of sort of a state manager. The Americans commandeer it for their troops. So, but they're not paying for it. So it's only got like 1 performance a day that's paying, 3 more for Americans. And of course, my grandmother can't can't leave England because she's stateless. But my dad he did a degree in Newcastle in electrical engineering, and was then the first enemy alien to serve in the Royal Navy.
Mhm.
And they moved into intelligence quite quickly. So they very kindly, he said, look, if there's a chance for me to go on a mission to Vienna, please can I go? So he went back to the cinema and found that the lady who ran the coffee, the sweetie kiosk was still there. And she told him that, the terrible news about the family.
Mm.
And, it was very, it was a very dilapidated cinema. And he found a very distant relative to sort of manage it. And then a couple of years later, my grandmother got British nationality and could go to Vienna and try and sort it out. And she spent several years trying to put the cinema back on a sensible footing. But then this is the really difficult bit. Her nephew had survived. He got an illegal boat to Palestine, because just like you've got boats coming across towards Europe now,
right.
You then had boats making the same terrible journey the other way. So he'd escaped and spent the war in Palestine, but came back. It's never clear when people come back. I think one of the things I really learned was the chaos after the war, and how long it took for people to get back to their homes, or to find out that they were never going to come back to their homes. So he comes back and basically makes a counterclaim for the cinema, and the papers are lost, which is, we found papers that say this court can't hear it, you need to go to the next court up, but we can't find those papers. The next thing that happens is the cinema was sold, and the nephew's name is on the purchase, is one of the purchasers, at the end of the list of purchasers. So it looks as though he's done the dirty on grandmother. He had no relationship with the cinema at all. But because she needed the money, because she needed to support herself in old age. So she was always very bitter about that.
Wow, I could understand why. Had he ever met her? Did he know her at all?
Oh, there's correspondence. I've got letters from grandmother to my dad, and quite a lot. While she spent about over a year in Vienna in about 1952, 53, and she's writing to him very regularly, almost daily sometimes. And I have no idea what got lost. I've just got this attaché case of mixed letters, and she's written to Peter saying, first of all, France appears, and they're clearly getting on all right, and then things deteriorate, and she goes, oh, I think I've got the measure of him, but God will prevail and I might succeed. And then there are one or two really, really angry ones. So I don't know what happened. I do know that my sister said that my dad did go to Vienna to see him when we were, I don't know, perhaps in the late 60s, 70s. And I think they had this huge row, and nobody ever spoke to him again or something. I mean, my dad wanted to sort of pour oil on troubled water, wanted to calm things down, because he was definitely a peacemaker.
Wow. So there was no contact with that nephew since, you have no idea whatever happened to him.
Well, I know he became a furrier. He had a furrier. He was a modiste actually was a modiste when he was very young. He carried on the family tradition. And before the war, he had a shop in Josefstadter Strasse, just down from the cinema. But then so did his uncles. After the war, he in Israel, he was a modiste of some sort and married. He returned to Vienna and he ended up having a furrier's shop that was really smart. I've been to the shop. It's not now a furrier's. In fact, my sister went and tried to introduce herself, but they threw her out. That may be because she'd not told them she was going or anything, and a teenager in jeans may not, with a rucksack, may not be what you want in a really smart furrier.
Okay, I guess so. That's fair. Jeez. Now, so that was Selma's son.
No, that was another aunt. That was Olga's son. Selma never had children.
Oh, okay. And what happened to Selma?
She died in Theresienstadt. I found the papers that say that when she was collected. So she was, apparently she didn't do anything to try and escape.
Oh.
The lady from the sweetie kiosk said, she had her suitcase packed and they came and got her. I found sort of announcements saying that anything she got's been confiscated. And then one night, this is one of the more shocking things, her death certificate just popped up on my screen. There's a lot of information that you can get from these databases now.
Wow.
So officially, she died of a pulmonary embolism in the ghetto at Theresienstadt, but she actually survived about as long as anybody did survive in the ghetto at Theresienstadt, because they're completely malnourished, they're not heated, diseases, infectious diseases are rife. So that's what happened to her. I did meet one grandmother's niece who also survived Theresienstadt, which is very rare. And so I met Fritzi, who at the end of the war, she survived and made it back to Brno. And unusually, her husband had survived in a different camp. And of course, they had to rebuild their lives from nothing. They had no home. Their health was broken. She couldn't have children because of what happened in the camp. But I did meet her in Brno in the late 80s. And she was just so matter of fact about it.
Wow.
So it was like, well, when I was a child, we when I was this big, we spoke German at home. Then at school, we spoke Czech. And then when we were in the camps, if we spoke Czech, they beat us. And she just said that as well, that's what happened.
So she wasn't bitter at all, or she just learned somehow to assimilate herself to this was the facts, this is what happened, and now I'm moving on with my life.
Absolutely. That's a very good way of putting it. She just got on with it.
Wow, you really do come from some resilient stock.
Yes, I mean she's really tiny, like grandmother, but not with grandmother's beauty. But yes, I think she would say, well, I had no choice. I mean, amazingly, she had taught herself, fortunately, she taught herself English, they could get Austrian telly in Brno, and she was using the subtitles to learn English. So when I got there, I don't speak Czech or really German. And so I was thinking, this is going to be good. But she'd learnt enough English to talk to me.
Wow, that's incredible. I don't know if you remember this, but when I first made contact with you and I said, my father is an immigrant from Czechoslovakia, and he and my grandmother managed to get out on the last ship out of Calais before they closed the port. And he was 12 years old at the time. And 5 years later, he joined the US Navy. He taught himself English really quickly. They put him in school with a bunch of, like kindergarten first graders, because he couldn't speak English. And of course, he was really tall for his age, and it was just a nightmare for him. And he was like, I got to take matters into my own hands. And he started taking night classes, learned English very quickly, and then moved up through the grades. I mean, it was just amazing, an amazing story.
It's with the Kinder, because they actually wrote and talked a lot about school.
Mhm.
Of course, and the local newspapers the first school was in Tynemouth, and they were obviously very intrigued about the hostel. And
Mhm.
so there's quite a lot of articles about setting it up. And then they interviewed the headmaster, who incredibly, because I mean, he's faced with 25 or 30 children added to a class he'd already got, none of whom spoke English. And he divided them up so they were working with English children. And he's very, very complimentary about the kids and how quickly they can write essays and things.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the girls, I mean, obviously when I met her, she was an old lady, Elfie. She sort of said, that she'd got to school and she was so proud that after a term or so, he said, well, of all the children in this class, this one has written the best essay. The English isn't perfect, but I can see that it's there. And I mean, one thing that it never occurred to me is that they didn't play team sports in Germany or Austria. So they could all swim and they could all do skiing, but ball games were just not something they knew. So Elfie was like, well, we played shinty, which is not a game that it's sort of stuck in the north of England.
Mhm.
And it's sort of like a cross between hockey and lacrosse.
Mhm.
But the whole idea was sort of quite relatively alien to them.
That's really funny. Wow.
But the teachers clearly were incredibly generous, because when the hostel starts in Tynemouth, in fact, BBC Radio Newcastle have just done a really lovely series of podcasts about it called The Girls. And but when bombing starts, they're given 3 weeks to move because it's a defense zone. You've got the problem, you've got enemy aliens in a defense zone. You've also got children in a defense zone who might get bombed. So they're given 3 weeks to move, and they move to Windermere, which is in the Lake District and very lovely.
Mhm.
And I mean, again, it's really difficult to see how you move 25, 30 girls and the furniture, and how you even find a house in Windermere or anywhere.
Mhm.
But they moved to Windermere, and when Elfie came to school leaving age, she hadn't got a school certificate, which meant she couldn't get jobs in a bank or whatever she wanted. And the teachers taught her out of hours at night. The headmistress arranged for her to have a different class every night with a different teacher, so that different subject, so that she could do school search, which was amazing. It was amazingly generous of the teachers, given that they'd already done a full day's work.
Now, at any given time at the hostel, the girls, what was the age range of
The
the
age
girls?
range was, the youngest was Inga, who was 5.5. She's currently 19, living in Wimbledon,
Oh my goodness.
and rings me quite often. And the oldest was about 15. I think the scheme stopped at 15. So the older ones, what the matrons did was they divided them up. There were 2 matrons. I can't work out quite how many girls there were, but there seemed to be 25 permanent ones, with quite a lot of coming and going, particularly at the beginning. So the matrons divided them up into little, middle, and large. And large were expected to look after middle, and middle looked after little. And I only been to the house in Windermere, and the current occupants were really kind and showed us round. And Alfie and Inga have both explained how the rooms were used upstairs. And it's a lovely big house if you're a family. The family living in it is gorgeous. But if you put 25, 30 girls, 2 matrons in, it's really small. It just thinking about getting that many beds, and I can see why. They have very little privacy. They just had a bed and a cupboard. And letters are really important to them. So they hide their parents' letters under their pillows and things.
Oh.
I think we have to remember the matrons were also frightened. They were away from their families.
Wow.
And when war's declared, they say, you mustn't speak German outside the house, and you must destroy all your letters. Now, it's Annie who, I mean, I met Annie many years ago. She was living in America by then. She said, well, it was obvious we were foreigners. We had accents. And the children didn't destroy the letters because they were too important to them.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad they
so-
didn't. And to have something to remember, you know, your parents or your family by, that would be so cruel to have to. It's just like a double
Yes.
whammy, you know, just
I-
exacerbates the pain.
One of the things, some of the photographs that are in the book and that I've got, Elfie explained that you could get street photographers would photograph you, and it was really important. They said they were, you know, it was a penny, but you could send it back to your parents to show that you were all right.
Oh,
so at first there's an exchange. I mean, this is 1939. There's letters and photographs, but then increasingly you get letters saying, "Oh, Daddy's going to help the Germans repair shoes," and things like that. And you know, when war comes, it all stops.
mm-hmm. Wow.
I think there were some Red Cross letters, but you couldn't say very much.
Mm-hmm. Jeez. So when did you decide that you were going to write this book?
Maybe 5 years ago or so. I'd started doing the research and finding things out, and because I'm used to writing things down, it sort of turned into a book.
The accidental author?
Well, yes, and then once I'd started, I sort of had to go on.
Yeah, right, right. So your family that's left, I mean, how did they respond? Do you have children? Do you have, you know?
I have one. I mean, like many refugee families, there isn't really any family. So I've got one sister who bought copies for her children and said things like, well, I think she bought copies for her grandchildren as well, but said, well, by the time they're old enough to read it, it'll be out of print. It's a very helpful comment. But yeah,
because I just think it's so important to have your family legacy passed on.
Well,
to generations.
I think of my niece and nephew. My nephew is a physicist who does computing. And I think my niece is interested in this sort of thing, but she's a busy working mum with two boys. I don't know.
Well, it is a beautiful book.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the photographs, just when you were showing me, just absolutely stunning. Now, you do have even more photographs on your website. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. They're just some from the book. I can always put more up.
Well, yeah, you don't want to have that many in the book because it gets awfully pricey to print then.
Oh, there's a lot. There's about 80 photographs in the book.
Really?
Yes, because they go right through from early pictures of Bruno right through. I mean, some I took right through to modern day. But my father was a keen photographer, so he took pictures throughout the war as well. So they're in there as well. I mean, there are the odd picture of a concentration camp, because when he was in intelligence, he went to them, or went to this one. Now again, I don't know. He hasn't. I know what it is, but I don't know where it is. You know, he didn't label things like that. But there's a really rich collection of pictures. It's been very interesting as I've learned more, being able to put them together.
What do you think your father's reaction would be if he knew you had written this book?
I'm hoping, well, I raided his manuscripts and the journal he kept during the war. I'm hoping he'd been pleased.
Well, I'm sure he would be.
One or two friends who knew him have said that, you know, they think he'd be pleased. So that's actually one of the nicest things people can say.
Absolutely. So tell us, how can people get a hold of you, Vivien? Give us the links to your website, any social media. Of course, this is going to be on the show notes forever and ever, but I really like the guests to be able to articulate where you can be found.
Right. Well, there's actually a Facebook group called Kino and Kinder. So if you just search for that,
Okay.
and it's growing a bit, it's not huge. I've got a website which is viviensieber.eu, Vivien Sieber, all one word, .eu. I'm on Instagram as Sieber Vivien. I'm on Twitter and things like that, just as Vivien Sieber. And you can get the book from any bookshop or Amazon or Book Depository. Oh, and it's on Kindle.
Okay. What do you want people to really gain from this book?
I want people to gain that we don't want this to happen again. We mustn't forget what happened and how incredibly easy it is to slide into totalitarianism. And, we are facing a shift to the right in England or Britain, and you've got Trump, and, we're seeing across Europe moves to the right. Alternatively, you've got Putin, and how horrifically quickly freedoms are lost.
That is a powerful statement.
Well, it's when you start looking at how a lot of that's not in the book, but how the Nazis sort of took over. And I mean, you get these heartrending things from the girls of, all of a sudden they go to school and they're told they can't sit with their friends. They have to sit at the back because they're Jews. So that's the other thing I want people to take away, is that any minority group, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or a racial minority, should be protected. I mean, there's no reason to pick them out and victimize them.
And no group ever should be marginalized in any way.
Absolutely.
We're all humans. We all want the same things. We all, desire love, security, affection, friendship, and we all want to live in peace and harmony. At least I hope the majority of us do.
Absolutely, and possibly in different ways that should be respected. Some people's customs are very different to other people's customs, but that doesn't mean that they're worse. They're just different.
Yeah, it's really funny. When growing up, we were taught to respect that. I mean, we never marginalized other people. I grew up in a small steel town in Western Pennsylvania, so there were a lot of different ethnic groups, religious groups. I mean, quite diverse, community. And we never did that. We never marginalized people or looked down on people. I don't, it was just like we were all kind of like one community.
I don't think that I was brought up in London, and it certainly wasn't like that. I mean, obviously, my grandmother lived in a sort of Jewish refugee enclave. It was Bayswater, and all most of her friends were refugees like herself. So that there was that sort of they obviously were very aware of what could happen and what had happened. So they think they were sort of hyper vigilant, but not far up the road, you've got Notting Hill, which was a very black area, and blacks were completely, the famous signs outside, but boarding houses and things, no Jews, no blacks, no dogs. So it was all very much more partitioned up I think in London, and I think it's still partitioned in some parts.
Well, I think where I grew up, there was a very large immigrant population. We're immigrants from everywhere. Again, like I said, my dad was an immigrant, and a lot of our neighbors were too as well. And interestingly enough, where he built a house in this area where we grew up, and my father actually did build the house himself. And it was on a hill, and across the street and a little bit higher on the hill was another family who lived there, who actually, they had been neighbors in Czechoslovakia. They had grown up in the same village. And there was a Jewish family who owned a candy store that my dad used to walk to and get candy. So it's like, what an incredibly small world this is.
They didn't know each other when they got there.
They knew each other in Czechoslovakia, and then it was like a coincidence that, oh my gosh, now we're neighbors living here in this small steel town in Western Pennsylvania. But so
I mean, I know one pair of friends who came over on the Kindertransport, and they ended up living next door to each other. They both married happily. They both happily married. He married an English woman, and she married, I think, a Swiss woman, a Swiss man. But they lived their entire lives as neighbors.
Oh, how sweet.
Yeah, like that one. Yes.
Well, Vivien, it has been such an honor to have you on the show. It's been wonderful talking to you. Congratulations on the book. I mean, what an endeavor. And I have to ask you one last thing. As you were writing the book, were you experiencing some of these, like this incredible emotional roller coaster? Were you kind of like inserted into the story?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is it started as sort of a detective story, like what happened to all these people. And through the research and writing it, they became real people. So I mean, I discovered I had an aunt I'd never a great aunt that I'd never known about. But then, Zelma became real. And so, yes, when her death certificate popped up, yes, that's quite upsetting. But the books, gradually, the last bit of the book becomes far more me. And, from when I met Fritzi back in Brno. And I've gone and got Austrian nationality. They have a scheme for victims of National Socialism. So it actually goes right up to me, because, and that was, at that point, a friend said, well, what do you think, your dad would have said about you getting nationality of the country that he was forced to leave? And I remember when somebody from the embassy rang my dad and said, would you like nationality, back in the 90s? And his answer was entirely anatomical. His English was honed in the Royal Navy, so he was very explicit what they could do with it. And my reply was, I think that he would be very saddened that I thought I needed it. Because don't forget, we've had Brexit, and I've always been European rather than English, or British. And I think Peter would have felt, yes, he'd have just been saddened that I felt I wanted the security of a European passport. I have to say, my sister doesn't agree with me. She's not going for it.
Well, I can't remember if it was in the 70s. I can't remember, but the farm that my father grew up on in Czechoslovakia, of course, the property was confiscated by the communists. I'm not even sure which party or who was in power or who did it, but that you could apply and get your property back. And so we were saying, why don't you do that? And he was like, I have absolutely no desire. He says, let them have it.
My father said very clearly that he didn't want to dispossess anybody. In our case, it was really complicated. It was in Hungary, not Czechoslovakia. There was apparently some property. And he said, look, the people there have been there for a long time now. They have a right to stay.
Right.
What do I want to do we've got a nice life in London. What do I want to go and buy a farm, throw people off their farm in Hungary?
Right.
And curiously, although he left all this paperwork and stuff, he destroyed all the papers relating to that.
Really?
Like that, yes.
Wow,
I never found them.
That's interesting. Wow. Well,
I think he wanted it to end. Right.
Well, I can understand that. And I think my dad felt the same way. He actually grew up really, really close to the Hungarian border. And he remembered, he was telling my husband, and he didn't really talk a whole lot about it to us, to my sisters and I, but he says he can remember, when things were really getting heated up, that he could watch actually the army, the Hungarian army, doing drills like right off of their property. And he told my husband, he says, and they weren't the good guys.
No, no, they weren't. I mean, one thing that's, having looked at this, is how fluid the borders were, because my grandfather comes, when you find out where he comes from, is a place called Gora Hamora, and it's 20 miles from the Ukrainian border in what's now Romania. And yet there's oral testimony from I think a cousin. I'm not quite sure how the relationship, but I mean, I did meet her when I was a teenager and didn't realize that actually she was a really interesting lady. But she just talks about the empire and going to Vienna. No, they moved from Romania to Vienna so her elder sister could go to school.
Jeez.
It's much more fluid than we're used to.
Wow. Well, once again, it has been an honor to have you on the show, and I have loved this conversation. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for giving me the chance.
And congratulations on the book. I think it's wonderful. I can't wait to read it.
Oh, thank you.
And everybody, thank you so much for listening. What a story, right? And just remember that things can go bad and we could lose our freedom really quickly. So just to be vigilant, be kind, be patient, and understand each other. I think we could make the world a better place if we would be a little bit nicer to each other. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.